Those of you who are in our live audience got a chance to hear Stevie Wonder's Higher Ground. Thank you, and for joining us for this episode of Centering Justice. My name is Yodit. I use she, her pronouns, and I created Centering Justice, this podcast, as a dream space, a podcast of possibilities. Each episode, I'm focused on amplifying the voices of Black and Brown and melanated dreamers and doers, alongside our allies and other change makers who are believers that we can be the bridge between the current world and a future world where we're all free. So welcome, everybody. And I am so delighted that this season, particularly because of the topic of deep democracy, I'm joined by my friend and fellow comrade, Ryan Hinyard. What up, though? Hi, Ryan. I want to know how you're doing, and I want you and our audience to know that I am tired. Oh, and I see Ari is here. Hey, Ari.
All right.
Good. Welcome. I wasn't expecting you till later. Are you able to hang out with us the whole time?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was coming in at the right place. So I'll get it off and get back on.
Okay, we'll see you in a little bit.
Okay,
So
you
good to
got
see
it.
your face.
Yes.
So y'all, I was trying to be grown last night, speaking of Stevie Wonder, and went to his concert in Detroit, which was fire. But I'm so tired. I'm so old and so tired. Um, Stevie themed his concert, Ryan, Sing Your Song as We Fix Our Nation's Broken Heart. And he opened the show with two of his children. And he talked a lot about this concert tour being a love song to the audience and to the nation. And of course, I grew up on Stevie, I grew up on his music, and it means a ton to me. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that so much of his music is a word you taught me. It's artivism, right? He's weaving music into really a call for the freedom, the equality, the human rights of all people. And, I was struck. It was such an intergenerational audience. It was a beautifully diverse audience. Um, it was, uh, I think, like you could feel the connection of each of us that had come, woven together by this thread of this great musician. So I'm a little tired, but my heart is full. And Ryan, the circumstances were such, this was supposed to be a girls' night out, and my girlfriend hurt herself. And
Oh no.
so I got to take my sunshine to his very first concert. And I told him on the way home,
Was his very first concert?
this is his very first concert. I said, you trust and believe you're going to tell your babies that your first concert was with your mama and you saw Stevie Wonder.
I'm pretty sure technically my first concert was Vanilla Ice with the Ninja Turtles, so he's got me beat by a lot. Um, I think that what an amazing thing to be able to share. And one of the things that I love most about Stevie's music and his artivism and the way that he brings his full self into everything that he does is that when you're looking back through those albums and you're seeing, all these songs, there's something like 50 songs that I could easily go like, oh yeah, it's like this is one of my favorite Stevie songs, which is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous um amount of production. But alongside of those, you'll see, you know, pans to ending poverty, like looks at how we take care of one another, anti-war creeds, songs, about ending apartheid on albums in the 80s when it wasn't cool to be able to talk about these things. He's always been able to be courageous
Yeah.
in his art.
Even Happy Birthday, which so many people sing
Yes.
again, was really him fighting for Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday to become a national holiday, right?
Right.
He publishes this song. Yeah, he's a powerful activist, humanitarian, and you felt that. You felt it last night. He walked right up to the line on, right up on the political lines. And then, I think appropriately so, left folks to sit with more than politics. Who do we want to be for each other and for community? It was really beautiful.
Having someone who calls us towards a revolution of love
Come
is
on.
an amazing thing, right? Like to have, you know, to have that voice and that intellect and that commitment to humanity, in a true sense is extremely special. Like it's hard for me to overstate, how much I admire him. Um, and it pops up all over the place. There's times when every time I hear my phone do text to speech, I'm reminded of the fact that a bunch of this technology wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Stevie Wonder. Um, he worked with Ray Kurzweil, who was, the wild futurist doing technology things, and
Mm,
said, "Oh, I want to, make this some of the successful technology of braille reading machine." Stevie single-handedly funds a lot of it. Um,
yeah.
a lot of synthesizers that we hear in music in the 80s and 90s are things that Stevie was the first person to invent or play or popularize.
Wow.
And there's so many places where his advocacy and his stalwart advocacy for disability, always just shines as something really strong. It helped me start thinking of myself as a disabled person and like not having a stigma to it. There was
Yeah.
some quote he said where he just refused to believe that 90% of the people in the world don't care about the other 10% and the other 10% of disabled people, and therefore he's going to work as if that is the case, that we care about each other. It's a powerful way of living.
100%. And speaking of power, um, it is, it was electric to feel him use his power in that way, to call us, I love how you say, to a revolution of love, you know, um, and the receipts that he has, decades. Stevie is now 74 years old, but his voice, um, it feels touched by the angels. And it had a way for me, at least last night, of just kind of um, soaking into my humanity and this like movie reel of my life. There were moments where tears came to my eyes, and there were, moments where I thought about, had this replay of time with my mom, and I really felt her spirit and energy there. And I feel really blessed to have grown up at a time when Stevie's music was so prolific, and to welcome him home to Detroit,
Yes.
especially with my son. So, y'all, this entire season, Ryan and I are exploring, learning the principles of deep democracy. And essentially, deep democracy has um, three things that undergird it. One is the awareness of power, how it works, how it moves, the importance of sharing and ceding power. Equitable power sharing is also important, our capacity to hold conflict. And we're going to get into a little bit of that today. The theme of today, power in the people, Ryan, is really me wanting to assert that I think there's a way in which we navigate power, like power in us, power over us, and power through us. And I want to explore, unpack, challenge folks who maybe find themselves stuck in a rut of everything is happening to me and therefore I'm powerless, to moving towards and talking about how we can build power individually, how we can build it collectively, and how we can practice um, power sharing in our organizations. Um, in deep democracy, voices that are typically marginalized are prioritized, they're included in decision making. The effect in that decisions are widely then supported, encourages us to think about um, uh, the ways in which deep democracy can draw us nearer to each other, the way that we can use it in our families, in our organizations and communities. Deep democracy views power as something that should be distributed. It should be inclusive. And I think particularly now, when during this particular election cycle, I think folks feel challenged by how can we push on political leaders to create what the popular vote indicates, which is um, we want a democracy that values not just the wealthy, not just the elite, not just a certain group of folks, but that sees all of us, our lives, and the use of our resources and the way those resources flow to our communities as vital and important, and that the way that we navigate democracy now, where it's kind of a majority win, and that majority is right now influenced by the Electoral College and by a system that doesn't value the popular vote, is we're challenging it. And so I don't know that while I think agitation is important, I think continuing to build power in communities that can shape policy locally and nationally is really important. So that's why we are like unpacking deep democracy and how it differs from the democracy that we are currently navigating. And today, I want to get into with you what democracy says about shared power and about how it will challenge traditional power structures, insisting that real change comes from sharing and not concentrating power. So we'll break down these dynamics, how they operate in ourselves, how they show up in our organizations, why conflict and our ability to hold generative conflict and principled struggle is so important and can help us move towards a deeper democracy together. And then folks might have saw Ari Weinzweig, who is the co-founder of the Zingerman's community of business and an author, is going to come. He's recently published 2 blogs, one on dignity and democracy and one on building democratic organizations that I'm hopeful will offer some practical tools as well. I'm really inspired by the work of Zingerman's. So I'm looking forward to, yeah. So let me get into 3 of the principles we'll look at today, and then we'll talk about them. So one is power awareness. Deep democracy recognizes and begins with recognizing power dynamics in every situation. This is something we talk a lot about at New, and what I want our listeners to be thinking about: who holds power, how is it being used, and most importantly, who gets left out. And as we begin to identify and answer those questions, we can see the invisible barriers that keep power concentrated, and marginalized people that have been pushed to the margins, keeping their voices silenced. Then deep democracy talks about equitable power sharing and challenges traditional hierarchies by advocating for the need to share power across multidimensional groups of folks, and not only ensuring that voices are heard, but I would take that a step further, which is to say we're centering impacted people in how we make decisions, in how we consider our work. I love, when I was new in organizing, this principle of nothing for us without us. And in my world, in nonprofits, I find that often that is not the case, that we are designing solutions and responses without centering or even asking the people that we're working on behalf of or working alongside, whether or not that's what they need. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And then conflict as a path to power distribution. So deep democracy does not shy away from conflict. We know that in a culture dominated by control, command, that conflict or open conflict can be scary for folks. And I find that a lot of us, including myself, are under practiced in holding and navigating what I call generative conflict or principal conflict. And what I mean by that is that you're not in conflict to win, you're in conflict to understand. So we'll get into that a little bit and hopefully share some resources. So I want to ask you, Ryan, a question that we ask often guests of Century Justice. You've been a guest, and I've probably asked you this question. It is, I'd like for you to share a story of transformation. So the question is like, when did you know you were transforming? Perhaps a moment or a experience when you knew that your way of being or leading was changing forever. So when you think of the concept of power in the people, can you share an example of how your relationship to power has been transforming or changing, and how? And how has that awareness impacted you, your work, your politic, Ryan?
Absolutely. I think that every time I've been asked this question, I end up responding with something different than what I planned, which is always a good sign that you pull things out of me that I wasn't expecting. Um, I think back a lot to um, the one of the big personal transitions for me. We in the early days of the pandemic, we're dealing with the George Floyd rebellion. We're seeing people out in the streets, and I, as someone who had been deeply involved in DEI work at the University of Michigan, where I've been for years and years and years, and trying to build power inside and trying to make things, better in all these small little ways. Um, Found myself really reflecting on, am I reaching the people that I want to be reaching right now? Um,
Mm,
am I focused on the university because this is the only place where I feel like I can affect change?
mm,
Because that's where my experiences are, that's where my connections were. Um, and I ended up launching a project to build a teach out. We built these open online courses to help share information. A lot of times they were really time sensitive or time relevant, and I decided to have the potentially career limiting role of building an online course about police brutality. Not the most safe subject. And in the process, found myself really leaning into this idea that, I cared much less about what, technically was the majority of my job, of building online learning for, college students who have access to all this information, and instead building something that was available for everyone and something that was really designed for everyone to learn together and to do so in a space that provided safety and in a place for constructive discussion, for generative conflict, for dialogue, and for growth without people always watching you as you grow through those growth points. And in the process, I found myself opening up and sharing more because I don't believe in asking people to do things that I wouldn't do myself.
mm,
And I found myself sharing more about my own political beliefs that I didn't think were going to be very popular, and talking about what I really thought about what was going on in our society locally. And so many of the things that I think that people point to as, you know, areas in which I am a leader in our community, as much as I'm iffy about, the idea of,
you are. You're a
title
leader.
of community leadership. Um, all of those things, a lot of them stem from the courage it took to own what I actually felt in public,
Mm,
and to be willing to grow and learn in public.
mm,
Um, and when I think about the ways that I've transformed in my way of leadership, it's been that I need to provide myself with the same openness to change that I provide to other people, that I have to give myself the freedom um,
mhm,
to discuss the things that are really important to me, um, to be willing to stand out on what I believe in and accept
mhm,
criticism or accept those things, and to say, I still believe that this can be better, or, I'm not willing to stay cynical about these changes. And then once that happened once, got addictive. And so now I've gotten into a habit of checking in with myself and saying, am I really aligned with my values and what I'm doing?
mhm,
And moving every single one of the projects and things that I work on to be more aligned with those values, and the difference between how I felt about my work, especially in the DEI space, beforehand when I'm trying to keep everybody happy and I'm trying to um, make sure that funds don't dry up or that projects don't get canceled, versus this braver space is night and day.
Yeah, I love you mentioning the importance of clarifying or knowing what your core values are, right? And then using those as a filter, but also to help you build courage, right? When I think about for myself the moments where my relationship to power changed, I think it was as I got more um, access to power, right? Um, so I remember initially feeling um, a bit uncomfortable with that power in that I think it was internalized. Like I think my internal dialogue was, do I deserve to be here? Do I have enough receipts to be in this space? But I think the the turning point for me was, what is the cost to the people and communities I care about if I don't say something? And so I remember people were talking about affordable housing in Washtenaw County a lot. And it was in the lead up to the now approved affordable housing millage. But the people that I saw talking about affordable housing had affordable housing, right? And while they were trying to advocate, I just felt the conversation was grossly lacking the people who actually were challenged to access affordable housing. And a culminating moment for me was I was at a Board of Commissioners meeting and I was sitting in the audience. I hadn't planned to make any public comment, but I kept hearing people use the word and it sounded coded to me. Like, um, who do we mean we want affordable housing for is what I wanted to hear, right? And where is that housing? And how do we reckon with the history and legacy of racial segregation in housing, right? Like the conversation was too savioristic for me. It was too, you know, white people patting themselves on the back for being good white folks for my comfort level. And the fact that I was in that space made me complicit, right? Like, oh, and because I had been invited by those folks. And so I don't even remember what I said, and honestly, I don't even remember the trip to the podium, but I remember that I got so filled, so convicted as I was sitting, listening to people talk about affordable housing in this hella coded way. And I just was like, can we stop using that word instead of saying, housing is a human right, and Black and brown and working class and poor people in this community deserve that human right as well. And, blah, blah, blah. But I think that was, I've been an organizer and activist for a long time, but that was the first time where like a more recent time where I remember challenging power among a group that all felt certainly like they were doing the good work.
Right.
And I think I've continued to do that, to kind of show up in that space when I myself need to check like the parts of me that are trying to, be on the right side or to be good, and then just to say it out loud so that hopefully more people are thinking about, okay, I'm in this space, but who isn't here, and I think that speaks to this idea of power awareness, right?
Yes.
Of understanding that dynamic. So for me, it was like an opportunity to kind of rail against a machine, at least in this community, that has an idea about itself that is in conflict with the realities here, especially for, Black and brown, but queer and disabled folk and working class folks in general.
Yes. The imagined Ann Arbor looms large in every conversation or discussion about not just like the city's future or the area's future, but also its past, because everything's recontextualized with this idea that we're on a long, arc towards progress that doesn't align with the lived realities of folks here.
And I used to say that was true about Washtenaw as though it wasn't true in other places. But like being in Detroit yesterday, have a same question. Who is this new Detroit for?
It
Right?
certainly was not for for me and mine. We used to joke that the queue line made sure that you got
Come on.
from your apartment, from your new condo to your downtown job without ever having to interact with the rest of the city. And I think that's one of the kinder things that I've said about it. And there are a number of places where we recognize what some of this like really oppressive power structures look like and how they show up in physical space. We talk a lot about buildings, about transit, about roads, or even like the way things are designed, like who is designed to
Mhm,
serve. um
mhm,
and I think that when we talk about like power analysis, the power awareness, um we think a lot about some of these really concrete things, but there's also a lot of stuff that's really um sometimes intangible. I think about how so much of what we think about in politics, in terms of who's winning the day and everything else, is you know is a softer power around
mhm,
influence, about who's carrying the news stories, or who's won over the journalists, or who's managed to make the influencers on TikTok or Instagram um like follow these things. And we're all looking for glimpses into trying to gauge the future. um so much of our culture and language is even influenced um by folks who we don't think of as having traditional power
mhm.
in
Yes.
the sense. If people have teenagers and they listen to a bunch of the quote unquote Gen Z slang or Gen Alpha slang, a lot of it is just straight up AV, or African American Vernacular English,
Mhm.
or Bonics, as we used to say back in the day. There are plenty of things where the there is something ineffable about certain parts of culture that pulls us into things, and there's a power in the ability to influence how we talk, or what
That's
what
right.
we listen to, or what we spend time with every day.
Yes. I love that. I mean, everything from, um, yeah, it's interesting. I've heard you made me think about, and what I think is really important about what you said in terms of soft power. Again, I want to hold this tension of the narrative around being powerless, right? That is a function of racism. Racism is power plus discrimination, right? So the narrative in media, corporate media in particular, certainly perpetuates a kind of single narrative about Blackness, right? Or when there is more room, it is valorizing like the Black ilk and the elite versus right the like don't be poor and Black. Um, but the reality is that so much of Blackness influences all of this culture and all of the people in it. I mean, from the music last night to, as you know, vernacular, the language we use. I mean, bling bling, right, comes straight out of hip hop. Like the music, the genres of music, the way we've influenced so much of American life with that sort of soft power that you speak of. Um,
And
what
I
are
and I
some
think a lot of
examples?
times when we talk about the soft power piece, it's diminished in terms of importance. We go like, well, that doesn't matter as much as some of the
Mhm,
other pieces. But um, I know that there's plenty of folks who've seen the broader attacks on DEI and in higher education, and the broader attacks on higher education in general. One of the biggest reasons for doing so is an open acknowledgement that these are
mhm,
places where the leaders of the future are influenced. And what governs their experiences will have impacts into the future. And so, therefore, it's very important to some people who have a lot of the harder types of power, whether they have the money or corporate influence, um,
mhm,
to control one of the areas where that influence is being delivered. That's why it's so important that we're attacking professors or worrying about folks being too woke in the classroom, or why it's important to it was considered important by our government to make sure that TikTok's Chinese ownership um, was diminished, because we're afraid of messaging and things being sent to change people's opinions about
That's right.
certain nations. Like, these are all things that, if they weren't important, people wouldn't be spending so much time and treasure to impact them when they have all these other things that we're
To
talking
erase
about.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that, would you say that folks understand that power? Like, I'm thinking about everything, media. I'm thinking about, cultural influences. I'm thinking about, um, a lot of, for example, there's been more recent, I think a lot more folks are talking about conflict. And here at New, we have been thinking a lot about, and we're doing a lot of work around distributed leadership, distributed power, shared decision making, and even consent-based decision making. So one of the ways you do that is through something called rounds, right? So you make sure everybody gets a chance to talk, so that the majority or the loud talkers aren't the ones that kind of move the direction of the organization. But these rounds are essentially the same talking circles that Indigenous and Native people had, that, influence how we hold conflict, how we ensure um, voices are heard, right? And so, um, how are you? I guess my question, like, how can we flip these cultural norms that we put women in towards those that are more revered in collectivist cultures, right?
Yeah.
Help me think about how we, because I mean, as a daughter of hip hop, I would say from us in many ways, and that a lot of that happened as the music moved from the streets to becoming um, a source of, money and power.
Yes. And I think that in order to do so, I think you do have to have some of that awareness. You have to spend some time
Mhm.
thinking about where you exist in the context that you're viewing this power, and understanding that it's not going to be the same every time. Your positionality, like who you are as a person in that particular room, can dramatically change how you view, or like what power is available to you, what power you're proximate to.
Yeah,
And that really makes a big difference in terms of what you're able to accomplish in those different spaces, and what you're willing to do in certain spaces.
sure.
I know that we've talked in the previous episode about some of our shared time on the care-based safety design team.
Yeah.
And I know that one of my very explicit um, hopes in being a part of that design team was a recognition that all of the people who were moving forward with that next part of the work
Mhm.
were women and femmes, and
Mhm.
that I had a very visceral reaction against um, leaving women and femmes to do all of the work. I've become very sensitive to feminized labor as someone who works in
Mhm.
higher education, and sees how, when labor gets feminized, it becomes devalued both monetarily and through like social cachet um
Yeah.
and availability, and going, this is a place where even just my presence will provide at least something to the group, in addition
Yeah.
to the work I'm going to put in, and the thought I'm going to put towards it. And that, and that kind of um recalibration about those things had to happen, because I sat in that moment and said, in this room right now, what is the need
Mhm.
for the power that I have potential to bring? And that could be different in different places. It's different for myself in some disability spaces where um, like where my disabilities make it so that there are some things that are much easier for me to accomplish, and therefore those are the roles in which I choose to take on in the team's work.
Right.
Um, and I think that as we grow our capacity for navigating our feelings around that, because it doesn't always feel good to realize like, oh, I have unearned power in this space. Um, and I don't think of myself as being someone who wields and uses power that way.
Right.
That's an emotion I had to kind of like learn how to handle and work past and go, okay, yes, this is how I'm going to show up here. I'm not comfortable with being being a person who has this thing here, but also I understand that it does exist and it's not something I'm making up. And so what am I going to do about it? How am I going to give it away? How am I going to
That's right.
redistribute it?
Oh, that's so important. I love how, so you start by talking about getting clear about your own values, right?
Right.
Then you talk about this kind of internal check on where are the spheres of influence where I can use my power in service of my values and also in service of the collective. And then where can I cede power that I have, share power that I have, once the awareness is there, but also when I become more aware of the surroundings and the places I am. And I think what's coming up for me right now is thinking about the uncommitted movement as we talk about building power, which is what I want to get into next. Not only how do I identify and understand our power dynamics, and also when we're navigating power dynamics, but how can we visibilize that power? How can we grow our capacity, as you note, to navigate the emotions in that? When is it time for me to step back, right, to allow other voices to lead, or to guide us? And I think about in the uncommitted movement that what folks were being asked to do was to engage in collective power of sending a message, right? And there was safety in that collective, right? And so I want us to think about building power as also keeping us safer, right? In that, not everybody can, which was the unfortunate case when you mentioned college presidents being fired, that, and it was something that I think a lot of leaders struggled with in the last year around what is my place and position and what are the ramifications of speaking out against something that's happening. In this case, um, the horrors in the West Bank, right? And so while trying to protect free speech, folks who say, no, I think that this public dissonance is important and this public conflict is important, and that's what higher education institutions are supposed to represent, but that coming at a consequence. And so recognizing that not everybody can do that, or that people are at risk when they do, there's real value in building power collectively.
And building power collectively, especially when you're building coalitions with people, there's different amounts of risk tolerance that people have. Some people
Right.
are able to be, loud and bold and strong because they don't have some of the same things to lose.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a real community brilliance that comes through in in finding these places where we have our different abilities that we can plug into things and go like, well, hey, this person here, they're working with our coalition on this, and they're not going to be able to talk openly because they directly work with some of the people involved, but they're
Yeah,
going to like funnel us information about what was heard at those meetings and make sure that we're all prepared for
that's
every
right.
conversation that goes through and that we hear all the scuttlebutt. That itself is a way to share and distribute power,
That's
that
right.
sometimes is really powerful and effective. We saw it during a number of protests around the attempted forced deportations, where we had people who were willing to stand at the airport and get arrested,
Mhm.
because they had social identities that allowed them to do so
Right.
safely without risk of permanent physical harm, and they used those as a way to protect others who didn't have that. All of those are opportunities for us to find ways that we can contribute or link in the same way that you talked earlier about how do we bring those marginalized voices at the center. when you bring something to the center, you're bringing it to the place where it's most protected, right? Like you're not just centering the
Into a
voice.
circle of care. That's right.
Yes. So
Yeah.
so the importance of the cause and and make sure those voices are guiding where the discussion is going, but also making sure that that there's safety in doing so. Because if there's no hope for psychological safety, even amongst comrades or people in the group, then you're not going to get very far when it comes to trying to make change.
Yeah, 100%. One of the phrases I hate to hear is um, I speak for the voiceless,
Yes.
right?
A red flag for me.
And yet, me taking part in care-based safety, um, I am less, look, I got to knock on wood before I say this. I am less proximate to police violence than others in our community. But I do feel, as someone who has that privilege of not every day worrying, am I going to die from police brutality? I feel I have a responsibility to contribute to, for those of you who don't know, care-based safety is a coalition of folks who are interested in an unarmed response program here in Washtenaw County. And I don't want police to show up when folks are having a mental health crisis or when they're navigating substance use disorders. I don't think that's what police are equipped to do. And I don't actually think we need police to keep us safe. But so while I am not directly impacted, at least not acutely, I feel I have a responsibility. That's different than me saying, I'm here to speak for folks who have experienced police brutality, right? It is me trying to use my body, my skills, my resources in service of a more safe community for all.
It's the difference between I am going to speak for someone versus I am going to stand alongside
That's
someone.
right.
And a lot of this work has been frankly a really virtuous reminder of the power of being able to share space and to walk alongside and to go like, yes, you're leading, but we are locked in arms, that we're able to do this together, that I'm, even if I'm not as proximate to some of these risks, I'm willing to take different risks.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was like, I'm willing to take some of these, um, potential social risks or career risks, in understanding that like, well, there are people who are dealing with much more physical risk right now in protest
That's
movements
right.
and things. um
That's right.
my disabilities mean that I don't think that I would do super well on the jail floor. I know for a fact that that's a place where I'm not gonna thrive. But
Nope.
there's a lot of places where I can use all the skills and resources and abilities that I have, um, to work alongside of folks who are at the front and to say, what do you need to succeed in this? How do we work together on this? Are there places for us to strengthen and support each other? How do I make sure that I'm aligned with our shared values?
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you saying that because I not only so especially in the Floyd uprisings during the height of COVID, as somebody who has an autoimmune disorder, it wasn't safe for me to be in the streets. Not only that,
Yeah.
I got a whole child at home and that I need to come home to and not and so I needed to show up in a different way. And I really lamented that initially. I had some guilt and some shame around not throwing my body in the streets. And I'm just grateful that there were other ways for me to contribute to movement and to keeping folks safe. So I'm putting a couple prompts, audience members, for y'all. I want to know ways in which you recognize or know when power is being hoarded versus when it's being shared. And also to this segment right here that Ryan and I have been talking about, like what are some ways we can hold ourselves accountable to using our power responsibly, especially when it's growing through collective efforts. So just sit with those, y'all. Answer in chat. If somebody feels compelled to come onto the mic, let us know. But want to get you all's voices into this conversation. We also welcome, Ryan and I welcome questions and points of clarity if you need them. Trying to look at me, trying to type in. There we go. Um,
Something while folks are responding to this that um, I definitely think about is one of the ways in which we give up our power.
yeah.
Because there's, we've talked about these different ways of viewing our roles in these different situations or different organizations. This idea of preemptive compliance, of that, there's something wrong happening and we know that it's wrong.
Mhm.
And we start recalibrating everything that we're doing to avoid bad faith actors, pushing us into something that we know is wrong.
Mhm.
Instead of saying you're going to have to make me do the thing that is against my values. There's so much that happens as I know it's sometimes called like chilling effects, where a legislation is passed and says that we're going to do this thing, and this is now suddenly illegal, even though it's something that's perfectly aligned with how we've taken care of things for forever. Abortion regulations is one that immediately shows up as a place of physicians often find themselves in a place where their hospitals are saying, well, we know that it's probably not enforceable, but we don't want to be sued, so we want you to stop right away.
Yes.
The fear
Listen.
of litigation, the fear of future things means that we end up complying with a lot of evil stuff really early, even when we know it's wrong.
Mhm.
And after watching so many folks correctly lionize John Lewis and his call to make good trouble. Later on in his life, I remember him specifically saying during one of the many times he joined in with sit-ins for younger activists that, did you think that good trouble means never breaking the rules if they're
Right.
unjust? Like
Right.
it's some of those things is like that's a place where we give away our power, is that when we look at something and go, I'm going to preemptively comply with something that I know is morally incorrect. Um,
Great example of that, Ryan, is the DEI rollbacks that we're seeing, right?
mhm,
So you have, a right-wing extremist go after the uh what was it called? The Founders Fund, Fearless Fund, right? And it stirs up a lot of fear about retaliatory efforts that would be made. And as a result of those fears, you see companies, um, many companies beginning to publicly roll back and announce that they've rolled back. And what struck me is how, and the irony is that Fearless Fund then settles, and essentially they have to sunset their grant program that benefits Black women founders of businesses, right? But they're able to continue with the rest of their work, which is more about funding, and providing investment, an investment fund in these entrepreneurs. Um, that being said, the fear of retribution was enough for companies that, literally last year were saying human rights and LGBTQ rights and the rights, the need to address systemic racism and oppression that is why we don't have a diverse workforce. They rolled those back out of fear. And the what I heard with Tractor Supply,
mhm.
um,
Tractor Supply Company, yes.
Lowe's, and Ford, which I'm going to say this, and I've only been able to validate it or confirm it in a couple of places, is that there is a single common board member that those companies have that came to those boards and said, we better lawyer up and we better pull back before we get sued. And I just can't imagine being the person in the room that says, let's not do the right thing out of fear for how it might, you know, hit the bottom line or how, I mean, that to me is unconscionable, and I have difficulty reconciling it. That's not for me to do. It is for me to think about in what ways can I make sure I'm not, allowing fear. Another just more practical example of this is a few years ago, um, we were having an internal conversation about driver's license requirements, right?
Right.
And there was a group of folks here who were saying we need to require everybody to have a driver's license. And my argument is not everybody drives. First of all, not everybody like has a car or drives or has a driver's license, but the majority of people who work here don't drive on behalf of the organization. So why would we create a policy that potentially impacts adversely folks who don't drive or who don't have a driver's license, meaning they can't work here, just to mitigate risk for a small few people, right? But I had to get HR experts, lawyers, insurance people to hold that conversation with us before we could finally make a decision to not do that. So my point just being that we have to really interrogate these ideas and notions of doing things purely for the sake of mitigating risk is the risk.
And I think that idea that like we can mitigate all the risks that we're seeing is one that we're constantly asked to do it. And so it just constantly erodes our decision making because we're constantly going like, well, I don't want to lose the whole fund. So we'll close
Mhm.
this thing for Black women, even though we know that it's, legit and we know that it's needed.
Yeah.
And that it's not.
Understand why when we know that Black and brown entrepreneurs have been systematically locked out of opportunity to grow and scale their businesses, why would a fund that is granting its own money be an issue? I couldn't get my head around that.
But I
We could
mean, I think that it's not that it's an illogical decision because they're saying, well, if this goes to the Supreme Court, they're going to just use it as a way to smack down other people. University of Michigan used to love explaining to me in a billion meetings and a billion councils about how, they were afraid of, if we went too far with our minority recruiting, then we could possibly lose all of the programs to a Supreme Court voting against us. Well, guess what? It happened anyway, even though we didn't do those things. So now we have none of all those empty chairs, the Black and brown students who weren't able to attend, still weren't able to attend because we didn't do
right,
the work because we were
right.
afraid, and then it happened anyway. Um,
Mhm.
and I think it does require a change in your frame of mind. And it's not that risk mitigation is something you should never do. It's that it's worth checking in and
That's right.
not doing it by default. Like
That's
the
right.
scariest thing is when it happens without a fight.
That's right. Absolutely. I want to talk about, speaking of fight, I want to talk about conflict.
Yes.
Um, and building our capacity to fight in ways that are productive towards just outcomes. Deep democracy would suggest that conflict can be a powerful tool for redistributing power. And so, how can we essentially reframe conflict as a necessary part? And yet, what I know, having facilitated lots of conflict, done a lot of my own work, is that conflict can be very activating for folks if we don't take a healing centered approach to holding conflict. It can shut folks down. It can put people in dangerous spaces. And I do want to shout out the workbook, Embracing the Gifts of Conflict. And I'll put a link into the chat before we hop off, and we'll be sure to send it out. But that workbook was really helpful for me and for facilitating with groups. One, why it is that we have the reactions and aversions to conflict that we do. Again, for some people, it is very real that they have spoken up and harm has come as a result of that, or that their voices were dampened or hampered by power, over them. And as a result of that, are sometimes reticent to get into fights or to fight for a cause, or to engage in conflict at all. And so, first, want to name that. And then the other piece is that most of us have been socialized in a culture where conflict is win or lose.
Yes.
Right? There's a binary, and it leaves very little room for nuance or for multiple truths. And so, because it's win or lose, that's how we go into it. We're often not listening. We're listening to win And as opposed to listening to try to find where the inroads are towards, shared values, towards um, desire for shared outcomes. Now, everybody don't, let me be clear.
Right.
Everybody don't deserve that, and everybody ain't trying to get there. But I am really talking about within our shared, struggle for
Yeah.
justice. How do we, and a final thing I'll say before I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Ryan, is it's been really hard for me to see Audre Lorde says we cannot use the master's tools to build our house, and to see even within um, organizing spaces, these fissures and factions that are emerging, particularly around the election. So, what say you on that, my friend?
There's a lot. I mean, because I think that the idea of conflict being generative is most powerful when there's a relationship. Like you can't have accountability without relationship. And in my own, general way of being in the world is I try to focus those relationships on places where I'm acting in good faith with people who are acting in good faith with me. If we are, aligned with some of the same shared values and we differ on others, then almost all the conflict that we're going to have is generative, because we're trying, like you said, not to win. This idea of everything being zero sum is coming from a place of fear, not a place of abundance, which I know that um, folks in the chat already lifted up as being one of the keys to changing our thinking about this.
Mhm.
But it also requires us to think about who we are in places of conflict. Like that turning towards each other workbook is one that really highlights how sometimes we come into conflict in the mindset of someone who things are being enacted upon or through versus someone who views them as a creative opportunity.
Mhm.
I think that at best conflict can illuminate needs. It can illuminate needs that people aren't always aware of. And when there's good faith in those discussions, and there's love at the center of it, there's so much that can be built on top of it. But you have to have that. In order to have that, you have to have some sort of shared foundation that you're all working off of. Um, I think that one of the big issues that we see within organizing communities right now is approaching our conflicts with each other the way that we're approaching conflicts with the external powers that are oppressing us,
Yeah.
and coming with those same expectations of bad intention or a distrust at the overall concept. In order to there's a Grace Lee Boggs quote that I love because I love Grace as a
Mhm.
Detroit legend, that you cannot change society that you can't change anything that you don't feel responsible for or become a part of, um, and become accountable to. So like if you're not, like throwing accusations from the sidelines doesn't
Mhm.
really impact people. All it does is make people inflamed and mad. When conflict comes from people who have an investment in you and your community's success, then
Mhm.
there's ways to be able to grow from this and to be able to say like, look, we're going to actually change the way we do things.
Yeah.
We're going to reevaluate. Yes, we set up this great community program. We're going to have this for all these folks, and here's the requirements. And someone goes, well, these requirements exclude everybody from my background. Um,
Mhm.
and the answer shouldn't be, well, you need a handout. It can be, um, we should reevaluate what it is that we're asking. What is it that we're trying to do? What are
Yeah.
we trying to actually get accomplished? And do we want to go there together? Um, because sometimes the answer is that we need to be working in some of these things in different spaces. And I could still love you and I could still be accountable to you
Yeah.
and things and know that like, oh, well, this area is not going to be where you and I work close together. But I am
Mhm.
still invested in our communal success.
Yeah, it makes me think like there's a role for all of us. It's great that we have talked about individual power, about now kind of interpersonal relationships and power, including um, with including holding conflict amongst ourselves. Um, I encourage people to take a look at that workbook, and I want to also ask folks that have resources around navigating conflict or suggestions on how you're working through that to drop those in the chat as well, and we'll get them out to everybody. Two things that have been really helpful for us before we welcome Ari. One is decolonizing meeting agreements, which is to say co-creating those with the people in our organization. So how are we going to be with each other? And then documenting those, so creating the agreements together, the ways of being, we call them, documenting them, and then coming back to them regularly. We name that we respect that conflict will emerge and that people, and we're going to approach it with restorative practices, and that we're committed to understanding one another's conflict styles so that hopefully we can work through that together. So I could say to you, Ryan, in conflict, I get really, turned up. And so I need time to process before I meet one-on-one, for example. Yeah. The other thing is with our core values here at New, we define not only the word and the definition, but what it looks like in practice. And that allows folks who work here and who are expected to uphold those values to know what the expectations are when they see it and when they don't see it. And a final point to yours is I have more than once said to folks that this might not be the container to hold all that you need. And I want you to try to recognize that yourself. And also, I need consent to be able to remind you of that if what you need can't be met here. I think that's the most responsible thing to do in conflict as well. So drop those resources, y'all. I am really excited to welcome a friend, a mentor, a fellow comrade, someone I just have a lot of love and regard for, and who I'm grateful for the lessons, the wisdoms, and the teaching. Ari Weinzweig, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Yodit. Hi, everybody.
We have a mighty audience of folks who are interested in centering justice and that listen to this podcast, and the folks who are on it to draw inspiration, wisdom, to advance a more just and thriving community for all of us. And we've spent the last hour, Ari, talking about power individually and interpersonally. We've talked a bit about conflict. And where I was really interested after reading the two blogs that you wrote recently on democracy and on dignity, if you could talk a little bit about this entire season of Centering Justice is focused on deep democracy.
Yeah.
Power awareness, power sharing, etc. That you with maybe a little background noise, some folks talking?
Everybody's talking about.
Am I hearing background noise or do I have background noise?
Is it possible you have background noise?
It is. I can move further away.
It's okay. It just.
No, it's good. It's good.
Okay.
I don't mind moving. I moved over there because I was worried about the wind.
I got you.
We'll see if it's better over here.
So we want to spend the remaining, time in the episode really talking with you, Ari, about how democracy, all the things, but specifically, how is democracy showing up in your community of businesses? I love, you did a lot of work around belief.
Yeah.
Great to hear about that.
Still doing it. More in your inbox at 4:00 today. Yeah. Is that where you would like to begin?
I'd love, can you briefly share a little bit about belief?
I can. And of course, just as preface, it's not like I'm the world expert on any of this. I'm just like everybody else trying to figure it out, messing it up daily and trying to recover with grace and having high anxiety about the election. But other than that, I'll tell you what I want to know, and then some of you have it, but my email is ari@zingermans.com. So happy to learn from all of you all as much as I can share with you. And then in the context of beliefs, there's a giant book about it, which I'm not going to fit the whole 600 pages into the next few minutes. But so I really, as Yodit knows, I really knew very little about beliefs in a conscious way. up until about 10 years ago. And I know that sounds crazy because I'd already been teaching leadership, writing about business. We had Zing Train already for 20 years, but I just really never thought about it. Like I obviously knew the word, but I had no conception of the impact that my beliefs were having on the way I behave, the way I see the world, etc. And I stumbled through a book called Transformed by Bob and Judith Wright, and I've known Bob Wright through some oddities of my personal history that nothing bad about it, but just I won't bother you with the details. But anyway, in there they had a little self-fulfilling belief cycle, which some of you have seen. It blew my mind. It's not the main point of the book. The book's good, but it was like 2 pages out of the book. But it blew my mind, and I started studying and studying and studying, and it's self-fulfilling. So it's basically saying that what we believe is driving our actions, which are driving the beliefs of the people around us, which are driving their actions, which turns out 95% of the time reinforce people's beliefs. So it really taught me, you know, that I had influence. I could change my beliefs. I could weed out unhealthy old beliefs that I had just sort of picked up through my mother or through society or through the news or whatever, and plant new beliefs, which take a while to take in the soil of my mind, but ultimately have made a really big difference. And because everything that's going around us, including democracy or the lack thereof, it's all about beliefs.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Before you got on, I was just talking about an experience confronting folks about what we believe about affordable housing, right? And for me, it came down to do we see it as a human right or like a privilege, right? What do we believe about that?
Yeah.
So when you think about then beliefs, what are ways, we've been talking a lot about power today, and so what are ways you see power at work in the everyday structures of organizations, and how can we think about shifting power, building, as you call, like democratic organizations? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I'll do my best. So, you know, just backing up to frame it through beliefs, maybe for democracy to really work in whatever form, my sense of it is like one has to believe that there's wisdom in all parts of the organization, whether that is a small business, a not-for-profit, like a community, a country, is that the Western world, we've been trained, all of us, to think hierarchically, which makes people think that the leader is the hero. The leader is supposed to swoop in with the answers, and then we're mad at the leader when we don't like what they did. But we're not really relating to the leader as equals. We're relating as, you know, we love them and then we hate them. And so democracy, whatever word you want to use, democratic practices, it really requires us to truly believe that there's wisdom in all facets of the organization. And so that's absolutely critical. It really requires us to believe in diversity, not just as a hiring program, but as a way of interacting with the world. So, you know, yes, of course, we need diversity of race, age, gender, sexual preference, etc. But we also need diversity of thinking and diversity that can be shared in a healthy way. When you're asking about conflict, one of the best things ever, and there's many that I learned from my loving business partner, Paul Saginaw, is a little saying that says, when curious, get furious. And another one is learning to
the other way around, when furious, get curious.
Sorry, when furious, get curious. I got so excited about the second one, which is learning to disagree without being disagreeable. And those two are simple maxims, but they work, you know. And so people like the idea of diversity, but then they don't want to have anybody disagree with them. And I like to be right too, you know, but I've just learned over the years to really experience and believe that through the diversity of the conversation, we're going to get to much more interesting outcomes and be able to come up with more creative, more caring, more holistic solutions through that work.
I'm really struck by you entered talking about how you know, you weren't an expert, but you're someone who's been practicing and repairing and things. And I think that both Yodit and I really value that learner mindset of how we approach the world. I think that in terms of belief, that core belief that the belief isn't that you're right, that you'll always be right. The belief is that you have the capacity to become more aligned or become more right over time. And it's really powerful to believe that, because it means that everything else can work towards that change.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just reflecting, there's a, Yodi probably saw it, but a piece I wrote last year, it was based on a like obscure history. So there's a very anarchistic, very democratic, very progressive uh, piece of the Kurdish lands in northern Syria that it's a non-state entity, so it's not a nation state, but they do remarkable work. Anyway, this woman, Dilar Derek, wrote a very good book on what's going on there in the women's movement there and stuff. But anyway, the subtitle was History, Theory, Practice. And the more I reflected on that, I loved it, because I think that's really what we try to do here. And that many people do one of the three, but they don't have all three. And without really understanding the history of how we got here, what worked and what went wrong, the history of, various methods of governance over the centuries, without having a philosophy or a theory or a set of beliefs around it, and then without trying to do it, like, you can't really make a lot of headway. And each of the three informs the other, and that's really where the most power comes from. So Yodit, I think you asked me about practices.
Yeah, and if there's time,
Oh,
Ari,
power. You wanted me to talk about
I
power.
want to talk about power, and maybe you can talk about it in the context of dignity. You've written a lot
Yeah,
about
yeah,
dignity. Mhm.
yeah. Well, again, I think, like, we're all unconsciously experts in power. And people, I would suggest, tend to confuse power and authority. They're not the same. There's a general, I'm stereotyping, which I don't like to do, but I would say there's a general belief that power and authority go hand in hand. But, I've learned through all this work, like, sometimes a passive aggressive person in a group with no formal authority actually has enormous power over the group. So I think just being sensitive, like, there's always power. There's no way to not have power in the room, just like there's no way to not have energy in the room. And it doesn't really go away. It just shifts around. So I think if we're conscious of it and we embrace equity, which everybody on this call does, the struggle for equity, the attempt, then we just try to have equity of power. And just like I say when I teach about equity inside our organization, I'm like, I know we're never going to get it perfect. It's always some imbalance. And like when I teach the new staff orientation class, I just say, look, it's not going to shock you. My pay is higher than yours. Duh. But if my pay was as much higher than yours as what you read about, like at General Motors, that's too much, So I think the same with power. Like, it's not a shock that, the managing partner at one of our businesses has more formal authority and in some ways more power. But the truth is, we want to create, this is what the democracy means in practice for me, is that everybody's voice can matter. And so using that to lead into the dignity, the newest pamphlet I have out, as Yodi knows, is called Revolution of Dignity in the 21st Century Workplace. And it really, the backstory is, it came out of my feeling of despair after Russia invaded Ukraine. Lord knows there's been enough tragic situations in the world. I'm not saying that's the most tragic. It's not hard to find Sudan right now, the civil wars that Yodi's family's endured in Ethiopia, the Middle East right now, guys. I mean, there's things here in the United States that we all know about that are painful. But anyway, that one, just saying it hit me emotionally very hard. I felt super helpless, and it was at such a large scale so fast, much like Gaza now. Sorry for the siren. Anyway, I try to deal with my despair by studying, because I'm an awkward, introverted history major, and that's where I'm most comfortable, is hitting the books and trying to learn. And so I started studying Ukrainian history. I'm a Russian history major, so I knew a fair bit about Russian history, but I realized I knew very little about Ukraine. And despite Vladimir Putin's belief that Ukraine has no history, it's not true. It's actually more likely Russia came out of Ukraine than the other way around. But anyway, the studying really helped me, and I discovered pretty quickly what I should have known or would have known if I had been studying earlier, which is that in 2014, when the Ukrainian people threw out the Russian-sponsored leader, it came to be called a revolution of dignity. And as soon as I read that, it clicked in my mind. Like I felt so helpless, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. And I was like, okay, I know what to do. If we create dignity all day, every day, in everything we do, that's how I can make a difference. Like I'm not going to go pick up a gun. They're not going to, Vladimir Putin's not going to take my call or my advice. You know, I got no influence on that, but where I have a lot of influence and power is how I manage myself and the dignity that I treat myself with, and then everybody around me with. And I realized too, in that context, that where dignity is the norm, people like Vladimir Putin can't really come to power. And conversely, and this is part of my anxiety around the election, I mean, honestly, I don't think we could work the way that we work in an autocratic country. Like, it's not like the next day the lights would get turned out, but over time, it becomes impossible. Like if you have a diversity program in Russia, you're going to jail. There's no pride parade in Moscow, you know, and so I don't know how many people in the US really understand what's at risk. But having studied autocracy, you know, most of my life in one form or another, it's pretty scary. But anyway, the practical application of dignity was my next challenge, because it's a nice word, but it don't really mean anything until you could define it. And so I just did homework, and I tried to come up with what I thought it would mean in practice, so I could share the 6 elements if you like.
Yeah, please.
Keep going.
Yeah.
So I think all of these, in honesty, will sound familiar to all of y'all. It's just putting it in a construct that's, for me, very practical and practicable, that I could just do all day long. So the first is to honor the humanity of every person that we're interacting with. Is to honor the reality in that sense that everybody is unique. That although there may be, you know, solidarity among groups or consistent themes of experience that cross various lines in society, that the truth is there's nobody like anybody in the world. Like there's only one Yodit, there's only one Ryan, there's only one of me, and that's a good thing. And so the more we can just honor who people are, they all have hopes, they all have fears, they all got anxieties, they all got dreams, they all got families and friends and things they're passionate about, and just taking the time to get to know a little bit about what's going on in their life. The second is to be authentic in all our interactions. And then it says in parentheses, without acting out. So this is to clarify that going, you know, yelling at somebody and going, I'm just telling you how I feel, is not helpful. Like there's ways that you all are familiar with without me telling you to be vulnerable and real and share your fears and anxieties and frustrations without making it into the other person's problem. And we just had Barb McQuaid from U of M Law School speak on disinformation at the Roadhouse last night. And I'm going to say that disinformation is inauthenticity, like it's not real. The third one is to make sure everyone has a meaningful say. And so in American, the surface level image of American democracy is that means you get to go vote once every few years. I'm going to suggest voting can be one piece of it, but as I remind people regularly, they vote in Russia too. It just doesn't mean anything, and that there's a lot more to having a meaningful say than just having a vote. So some of the imperfect ways we try to practice it here. We've been governing our organization by consensus of our partners group for 30 years this year. Started as 7 or 8 of us, I think. Now it's like 21. Of those 21, 3, and it should be 4, but one had pulled back because she had a lot going on in her life out of work. Our staff partners, so they're not managing partners, they serve 2-year terms. So that's one way. Another way is that we pretty much opened up all our meetings. So you want to come? Hardly anybody does, but they could.
Mhm.
Tomorrow morning, y'all are welcome to. You won't get paid for it. They will. But 9 to 12 is our ZCOB wide huddle, Zingerman's Community of Businesses wide huddle, 9 to 12 at Zing Train. And there'll be, I don't know, between probably 40 something in the room and 30, 40 more on Zoom, 70, 80 people out of 700. I mean, I wish it was 200, but given that we're open and people are working and all that is pretty good. So the meetings are open. We have our bottom line change process, which some of you might know, which means anybody can really initiate the conversation around a change. You may not be the decision maker, but you can initiate the conversation. And to your point about power, where people are have a meaningful say, it means that sometimes like I don't know, a relatively new employee has an idea, but people listen to them often more than they're going to listen to me because they're tired of listening to me. And when we give them the tools to actually bring their ideas forward constructively, it can be really awesome.
Can I interject in there just with
Yeah, absolutely.
two quick stories around that? So I sat in a bottom line change training years ago, and one of the examples that the facilitator lifted up about change management was so practical. They talked about how we make decisions about moving office equipment and furniture. And what they said, which was really relevant for us at the time, is like somebody, generally not the people who use the copier, are who decide where to move the copier, right? We bought a new copier, we're gonna move it over here. And you've never actually engaged the people who use the copier regularly.
Yeah.
It just was one of those, like similar to what you were saying earlier about reading, about a revolution of dignity. It was like a light bulb moment for me. And I thought about all of the ways in which we were making decisions that impacted people in our organization who were not involved in the decision. And then we were managing to the problem, like their disease,
Yep.
whatever the decision was. The other
Yep.
thing I want to say, that because I'd learned that from you all years later, you invited me to a meeting that was open and something was said that kind of
Oh
rubbed.
yeah. Yeah.
And I circled back to you and to that team and said, hey,
Tara
this
Lynn,
I
Tara
heard,
Lynn, Tara
yep, this
Lynn.
thing
Yep.
I heard didn't really sit right with me. Now, mind y'all, I don't work for Zingerman's. I was visiting a meeting. I just happened to hear something. I gave the feedback about how the word, landed for me. And they wrote me back like 3 months later and said, just want you to know, we're never using that word again. And we've changed our process. And
And they use bottom line change to do it.
they did. And I wasn't surprised, like given who y'all are, but the ease with which you take in the feedback, there wasn't a lot of like butt hurt feelings. It was like you're able to hear it, receive it in the way that it impacted me, and then use levers of influence, change, power, what a democratic process to change it. And that meant a lot to me. It meant a lot, and it empowered me to think about the ways I can receive difficult feedback and not internalize it or personalize it, but hear it and consider it in terms of, change that can be made. So
And
you
it helped our organization too.
absolutely. And I think that's what I wanted to name, is that I think a lot of times our aversion to conflict means that when we hear critique or criticism, we get defensive and want to
Yeah.
rationalize why we do a thing versus being able to hear and receive the opportunity for creativity, innovation, shifts. Okay, so
Yeah.
honor the humanity of every person, be
Yeah.
authentic in every interaction, make sure everyone has a meaningful say. What's number 4?
Number 4 is back to the belief stuff, is to begin everything with positive beliefs. So in my work, I like to, where I can, find simple models that honor the actual natural complexity of the world. So like it or not, the world is complex. There's no point fighting it. But I like simple models that allow me to process things and deal with that. And so I started looking at beliefs as the root system of our lives, because hardly anybody's talking about them. They're all arguing over tactics. So they don't like the plant that grew, but they don't actually dig the root out. They just cut the plant. And then guess what? It just comes back. So with that in mind, I started looking at beliefs as 3 categories: negative beliefs, neutral beliefs, and positive beliefs. And if beliefs are the root, you don't have to be a farmer to figure out negative outcomes always give you negative. I mean, negative beliefs always give you negative outcomes. Positive beliefs, positive outcomes. Neutral beliefs don't do much. This is not false positivity. There's loads of problems. but you could have negative beliefs about a problem, which is basically we're victims, nothing we could do, we're helpless, it's their fault. Or we could have positive beliefs about a problem, which is what new is all about, which is this sucks, it's not equitable, it's not right, but we're going to get in there and do something about it. And so this is just taking the belief that everybody's doing the best they can with what they got. And it doesn't mean I got to roll over and not disagree with them, but it just means making up stories about what, how they're out to get me, or they're going to do. It's like, just for whatever reason, man, they have a skewed view. My perception, they have a skewed view of the world. My perception, I don't agree with what they're saying, but I'm going to choose to believe they mean well. It makes my stress lower, and I think it opens the door to more conversation that can get somewhere. If we have time, which we probably don't, I'll give you a little story that's real life happening. Number 5 is to commit to help everybody get to greatness. So sometimes in our organization, like somebody might be 17 and they're working for a year before they go away to college, and they're working 2 days a week, but it's still helping them get to greatness because they're learning life skills. They're learning how to think as a leader. They're learning stuff they're going to carry with them for the rest of their life. Other people, like I'm sitting at the Roadhouse, Lisa Schultz started as a server 20 years ago. Now she's a managing partner, right? So everybody's different. They all want different things, but helping them get to greatness by their frame. For clarity, as we talk about it, it has to be within our values and our vision. So if somebody comes tomorrow and goes, I want to start the American Nazi Party chapter at Zingerman's, it's going to be outside our values. I could still treat them with dignity, but I'm not going to go forward with that. And then the last one is back to equity and trying to create some reasonably effective application of equity, which is I already touched on, is challenging. So those 6, and it's just my challenge to myself is, can I do this all day long, every day, at home, at work, you know, with people who don't vote the way I vote, with people who don't agree with me in a meeting, with my relatives who might make me crazy, with, you know, whatever, and just with a customer who's complaining, can I do it all day long? And then it's not for a week. It's not a weekly program, it's for life. And you know, when they started the demonstrations in Ukraine in the fall of 2013, which ended up 4 months later throwing out that Russian-sponsored leader that became the Revolution of Dignity, the original call to go demonstrate came from an Afghan Ukrainian journalist named Mustafa Nayyam, who was in his 30s at the time, so in his 40s now. And I don't really go on social media, but he posted on Facebook, you know, okay, y'all, who wants to go to the Maidan, which is the central square in Kyiv? Who wants to show up at the Maidan at midnight to demonstrate? And then he posted a second thing that said, likes don't count. And I love that because, you know, when I teach this, I'm like, and I did a big talk on it in New York at a restaurant conference a year ago, September. I was like, I'm not looking for y'all to make Instagram posts about dignity. Like, I'm not saying it's bad, but this is about how we treat the dishwasher. This is about how we treat the employee we're about to fire. This is about how we treat the customer who's making, you know, we perceive as making our day really difficult. That's the challenge.
What I'll add there is that in by making that choice, because you talked about the choosing to do this on a daily basis.
Yep.
You enable other people to be able to approach life that way. Every person who sees, you know, the community of businesses now knows that it is possible to do things in a different way. And just that illumination itself is something that is itself influence and itself is powerful. Like I haven't talked to either of you about this, but I did Zing Train way back when I was a very, very early career person. And it was such a transformative experience, in part because it was like, oh, there is a way to do this aligned with my values. I don't have to try to figure out how I'm going to survive in any kind of corporatized environment because I know that out there is something that aligns with that. And I can always move towards this. I can always know that I'm moving in this direction. That itself is, you know, a helpful discipline. And, you know, Mariam Kaba says, like, you know, hope is a discipline. It's something that she, you know, that she constantly chooses and builds on day to day. And I think it's the same way with dignity. And by choosing that on, you know, day in and day out, we get closer to a world in which we are actually, you know, caring for each other, bringing each other to where we want to go. And those positive beliefs of the world can be different because I am choosing to make it different every day.
Couldn't agree more, Ryan. And it's you know, in the same way that I hope Kamala Harris gets elected, it's going to change the perceptions of young girls of color about what's possible for them.
Yeah.
Then it's not like we're the only ones, but the more organizations like us that are out there in the world that show that you can be imperfect and mess up daily, but still keep moving towards a more positive path than some of the ways that we're talking about on here, then it does change what people perceive as possible. And Yodi, you'll see it later, but I didn't share her name, but I shared the story of an employee. She'd been here about 6 months. Everybody likes her. She's doing great. She had a lot of years of restaurant experience, some hard times in her life. She's, you know, getting back on her feet and stuff. Anyway, she's doing great in the actual job. And anyway, I was just chatting with her. I'm like, how's it going? She goes, it's going good. You know, I finally realizing, like, I finally get it. She's like, it took me like 6 months, but I finally realized, like, everybody's not out to get me. And, you know, she's like, I've worked in so many places where I didn't trust anybody. And it's like, I realized I could just relax and be myself. And it's like the fact that it took her 6 months in a way is a long time, in a way it's a short time. But some people never get that experience, and they go through 30, 40 years of work and they're just always trapped in the corner like that.
For me, dignity is a inherently anti-capitalist tactic. It is about valuing people over, you know, profits or product or process. And while it seems sort of simple, I think it is easy for us to get caught up in so much of what we've talked about this episode, you know, feeling that power is not within us, but we're only at the affect of it, or having power and not seeing the value in sharing it and seeding it when it's appropriate. I think many of the folks who follow Centering Justice are working in organizations and are leaders themselves, and are trying to think about how to dismantle, you know, really archaic and oppressive ways of, you know, running our businesses and also engaging with our people. So I honor the courage of folks here today that are thinking about that. I hope that they'll look more towards what, you know, Zingerman's is offering, similar to Ari. You know, a lot of what we do here, we are more than happy to share, and to pass along to folks who are interested. I guess I will close. Do you have, Ari, a favorite quote or an anchoring quote? If anybody's read your essays, they're filled. I know that this is probably difficult, but
I got a lot of them.
Yeah.
I'm gonna find one in honor of Ryan's comment, but give me 1 minute and I'm gonna do
Absolutely.
that.
And folks, thank you for sticking with us. We are going to be wrapping up soon. I want to remind you, if you're still on, Jess, I want to shout out Jess, our showrunner and producer, who's in the background. She just dropped a feedback link. We really value your feedback about Centering Justice, and especially about the content and how we can improve it. Guests you would recommend, again, in this topic of deep democracy. Ryan and I welcome guests. And then I welcome your financial support. We need it. Centering Justice is an offering to community, and it does take both people power and resources to make this thing run. So please consider making a contribution if you're a guest today. It can be $5, $10, $500. We welcome it all. All right,
Yeah,
what you
just
got for us
to state the obvious, encouraging everybody to vote,
Yes.
because that's self-fulfilling belief cycle. If we believe our voice doesn't matter, we'll find a lot of evidence for why it doesn't.
I could do a whole other episode with you on this, because I think that what I'm seeing, Ari, in my world is that some people are choosing not to engage in the two-party system, right? To either vote for a third-party candidate or to withhold their vote as a way to build power against a system that isn't working for everybody. So I want to hold that. Yes, I think a strategy, some folks feel like they have to fall in love with a candidate. I think many of us understand that this is a strategy right now on November 5th, a strategy to try to push our leadership and our systems towards something that's more just and thriving. And I honor that for some people, particularly folks who are acutely impacted by the decisions and the actions of our government, that power that they want to enact and hold is to withhold their vote. And the only thing I would ask people to think about is that, and it's something that I'm grappling with myself, is when I'm in the voting box, I am not just voting for myself or my family. I'm voting for my community and for, the folks that I care about. So as you're contemplating your decision in a couple of weeks, I would ask folks that are paying attention to consider that.
Yeah, and I'll share, and then I'll share the quote for Ryan. But one thing I didn't say, but what I mentioned, that we've been governing by consensus, so that partners group, and one of the key elements of it that's made it, I think, more powerfully effective than American governance, is that when we come to the decision point, we're all charged with making the decision that's right for the whole organization, not the decision that's right for our part of it. And so instead of, like, I'm the senator from Montana and we only got 1 million people, but this is bad, right for the country, bad for Montana, I'm going to block it. This is where it's like, well, it's not great for Montana, but we're a tiny part of the whole country, so I'm going to support it. So anyway, Ryan, this is for you. Marcy Shore is a historian of Eastern Europe. She went out onto Maidan Square during those demonstrations and afterwards to interview the people who had actually been out there. And I like oral histories. People were really talking to not the famous people, but the people who went out and got it done. And this is a quote from one woman who was out there. It only shares her first name, which is Anastasia. But she said, everyone needs to decide. It's necessary to believe and it's necessary to act. Today, it seems to me a time of responsibility for every person concretely. Each person is responsible for our future. Everyone. Every person needs to decide.
I love that. I can't think of a better rap.
Well, honored to be with you all.
Ari, thank you for being with us. Thank you, everyone that stuck with us a little bit longer to hear that beautiful closing quote. You're welcome back anytime.
Wow.
And again,
welcome.
Thanks for joining us today, Brian. Again, another great episode. Look forward to next month, where we dive in even more deeply to deep democracy. Take care,
Yes.
everybody.
See y'all soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.